And thanks so much for staying with us here on Morning Live. Now, the Independent Electoral Commission has expressed satisfaction with the manner in which voter registration got underway this past weekend. Political parties were out and about, mobilising potential voters as the country gears up for the 2021 local government election on the 1st of November. There were isolated incidents of political intolerance as seen in Pietermaritzburg in KwaZulu Natal yesterday, as a group of people in ANC T-shirts tried to prevent EFF leader Julius Malema and his entourage from entering a voting registration venue in KwaDambuza. And political analyst Dr Ralph Mathekga joins us now for his perspective on the process thus far. Dr Mathekga, thanks for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina, and good morning to the viewers at home. Thanks for inviting me.
Let me start by asking you about your observation of the voter registration and the campaigns this past weekend.
I really think, Sakina, if you take into consideration that parties have about 6 weeks into these elections, that they did not expect to be doing this thing in such a limited space of time, I think, as the saying goes, they've had to hit the ground running. And I think that they tried their best, they spread themselves according to where they think it is strategic for their parties, some that we're observing in different areas. So I think the IC is also mentioning good number coming out given the circumstances of people who weren't registering. The unfortunate instances of voter of intolerance, those are quite sad. The instance involving where the EFF was prevented, as you mentioned there, as well, the protest as well in some areas, but we are used to the protest during this time. So I think nothing quite unusual, Sakina.
And we saw the EFF leader Julius Malema's reaction to all of this after being blocked from entering a voting station, a registration site in Pietermaritzburg, going out on the streets and saying he's doing that walk to show that he will not be intimidated and there will be no-go areas. But how much of a concern is political intolerance for these elections, Dr. Mathekga? And should these incidents be read as a sign of caution, especially in a province such as KZN, as it has become notorious for being a hotspot for political hits? And just recently, we saw 3 women who were shot dead in Inanda.
I mean, Sakina, what you're asking has come to my mind a couple of years back when I had to look as to whether South Africa's elections can be said to be credible. Generally speaking, we have a good environment for free and fair election, but we have instances, Sakina, that we've carried election on election, instances that have become part and parcel of elections. I mean, listen to how I'm speaking about intolerance towards the EFF. It's as if we are used to it. I'm saying nothing unusual because indeed we're used to having these instances. We shouldn't be having instances of no-go area. KwaZulu Natal is one of the provinces that is known for that, and it is the province that is known for political violence as well. Killings highly concentrated in that province. It appears as if we are willing as South Africa to leave that province behind to harbor those situations that involve instances of no-go area. We should not allow that. But generally, I think our elections are free and fair. Our elections are credible. Even now, under the moment of COVID, one cannot say particular parties are unduly or excessively impacted by the COVID than others. There is quite a reasonable, I think, prospect for free and fair elections here, Sakina.
And of course, the EFF saying they're taking this election and their campaign to what was formerly ANC strongholds. And of course, others also trying to make inroads at a time when the ANC seems to be at its lowest point. So just in terms of that, and of course, the pushback from those on the ground, should we be concerned though, Ralph, or are we relatively satisfied that the country, the state in which it's in, our democracy, and of course the rule of law will prevail?
I am concerned, Sakina. I spent the night looking into these elections, trying to explain what is it that is happening. I mean, the polls are indicating that the ANC is coming out not so well. But something that is very interesting as well, Sakina, is that when the main party, the dominant party, is losing voters, you expect to see consolidation, perhaps in the direction of opposition parties. But you are actually not seeing that. It remains largely the story of the ANC. This is still about the extent to which the ANC can lose voters. It is not about how the opposition can actually strategize and form some kind of a coalescence of a political project or an alternative political project that shows consolidation. What you have is that you end up with elections that only bring in more fragmentation. No one has really grown. The bigger parties have lost votes on the margins, but no opposition has shown significant growth, showing that they are consolidating. It's almost like stagnation of politics. And I think this is our local government where it is. Voters leave the ANC, but they don't find alternative where one can say consolidation is possible. That's the problem with this local government.
And what's your view, Ralph, on the ANC strategy going to communities this weekend, and this notwithstanding its dispute and tensions within the party? How did you think it was generally received by communities?
Communities were asking questions. We were looking at the reports about President Ramaphosa having to answer some of the questions on the sideline of visits to the communities. And Sakina, they have no choice. In the election strategy, it looks as if they cannot rely on their own internal structures. That is the ANC. Their branch system seems not to be functioning very well. There are disputes all over. That is why going into this election, it seems as if communities are their last point of stop here, because they are even saying that their candidates needs to be assessed. I don't know what term they use there. Assessed or checked with the communities, creating problems within their own internal system. So, because their own internal system, Sakina, is quite failing to a point where it is incapable of presenting the ANC in time as an option. As you and I are speaking, we are waiting on the decision as to whether they will be allowed to register in those 93 wards. That just shows the difficulty. But going into the communities is not going to solve a problem. They are trying by all means to say we are building new allies with the communities. We are trying to take the ANC into the communities. But it is such a weakened and wobbly ANC that it seems as if it doesn't have much to offer to the communities.
And now we saw yesterday, Ralph, the City Press story on the report that was presented by the Electoral Commission led by Kgalema Motlanthe to the ANC's National Executive. Now, it states, among other things, that divisions and factionalism between the CR17 and RET groups, also rogue regional secretaries and gangs who seem to have taken over the ANC, are actually killing the party. So does this election find the ANC in a position that may be really precarious due to its internal challenges, and now adding to that you have the financial situation as well? What does this say about where the ANC is headed? There was a question yesterday to Julius Malema on that campaign trail asked by Vusi Khumalo, our reporter, where he said there have been complaints that EFF supporters were kind of superimposing Julius Malema's face on ANC posters, to which he responded saying the ANC doesn't have posters. So we haven't seen much of those around as well. So that financial situation also very evident at the moment.
Sakina, this is going to be the most difficult election for the ANC. You correctly point out there is a lot happening to the ANC at the same time, and I don't think that the party can handle that. I'm seeing the party that is experiencing serious fatigue going into these elections. Let's start with the internal structures of the ANC, where the branches are. Compared to other parties, if you compare the ANC to the DA, for example, the ANC's campaign to the election is usually driven organically, is driven by the branches of the ANC, which are well aligned with the structures of government. You've got the wards, you've got the BGMs, you've got got the regional leaders at that level, being able to assess leaders coming to represent the party at that level. And the campaign is driven by those people, the door-to-door, organic mass campaign based on the work of volunteers. Of course, they go to stadiums, but largely the ANC's campaign is driven by volunteers. So, Sakina, when you have leaders at each other's throat, as we are seeing now in the ANC, you have got factionalism to an extent that is admitted in this Motlanthe report. It rips through the structures. It results in the ANC structures being caught as to whether Mr. Mahuma Pelu is still a member or not, instead of marshalling a campaign in Northwest. Those are genuine issues. Whichever side of the faction you sit within the ANC, you have to acknowledge how factionalism is affecting the campaign breadth of this party. So these are the difficulties that they are having. But against all of this, Sakina, they are also experimenting with trying to get the party work through communities. Their structures are actually very angry with this thing of saying that we are going to assess leaders with the communities. It is because of the internal problems of those structures going in. And now they are also, Sakina, confronted with a very unfamiliar party finance regime demanding disclosure and the capping of finance as to how much donations can be made to political parties. They're handling all of this against the backdrop of collapsing local government, which is their responsibility. The only reprieve that the ANC has going into these elections is just the poor opposition, which is failing to consolidate. You have got further fragmentation with new entry into the opposition. That is the only reprieve. That is why the ANC here is going to run a maintenance campaign, Sakina.
So, and I meant to ask you about that next. How does the opposition capitalize on this low point that the African National Congress finds itself in? You have the official opposition at the moment, the Democratic Alliance. How are you assessing their campaign at the moment? You know, they've unveiled their candidates for mayoral positions and some of the new entrants as well. Do you see them making any sort of inroads here? Let's speak to that fragmentation of the opposition vote and some of the more prominent parties as well.
Sakina, of all political parties that are contesting these elections, I can say that the DA is one of the parties, or the only party actually, that has been technically ready for these elections. Remember, they never favored any postponement of the elections far back. They have held their own conference in the form of a hybrid involving digital and some people attending in person under the conditions of the pandemic. The DA has been trying to exist under the pandemic, but yet, Sakina, you don't see traction on the ground, and it remains the story of the ANC. It's not about the story of the DA. When you look at the polls, the DA is being pointed to as one of the parties that will most likely lose votes on the margins. If you look at the by-elections that have come about, the so-called Super Wednesday some months back, you find the DA that does not come out as being able to actually capitalize on the problems of the ANC. I mean, Sakina, if the ANC is experiencing the level of credibility crisis that the party is experiencing now, coupled with administrative problems, some of which result in the party not being able to pay salaries, and yet the opposition cannot capitalize, cannot craft a political space that tries to offer an alternative. When will that be possible? And this is where South Africa is headed to: completely fragmented politics with no center at all. Not even a center formed through coalition by the opposition is likely on a medium term here.
And we've always spoken in elections about youth apathy, Ralph. Is that picture changing at all? We saw the ANC's Fikile Mbalula saying the youth should be flooding the social media platforms. But, you know, where's the ANC Youth League, for example? You know, what's the role exactly of these youth formations in the political parties? And do we still see that same pattern of voter apathy among the youth, or are things changing in that regard?
I mean, Sakina, the ANC Youth League has rebranded into the EFF. I mean, I beg your pardon, but on a more serious note, Sakina, since Malema left the ANC Youth League, it has never been able to gain strength. There's been one task team after another. Their relationship with the youth has not been quite strong. The EFF clearly displaced the ANC from the point of view of the youth. But yet, be that as it may, with the EFF's success in trying to get the youth vote, you don't see a distinct youth vote in South Africa. I don't know, Sakina, maybe some professors will help us out there. Maybe it has to do with the fact that South Africa simply just has conservative politics to a point where politics is dominated by the elderly. It's not about the youth. The youth is unable to express itself as a distinct vote and is unable to express itself in various institutions of power in our society. So maybe that is the case. We are not yet at that point. If you look at the average leader of a political party in South Africa, is somewhere at the age of 60, with a little bit of a distortion created by the EFF with the young leader, the IFP recently, and so forth. So, Sakina, we are struggling. We don't have a distinct youth vote. Numerically, you do have number of young people being the highest in the population. Supposedly, we have the younger people, and I think it's a fact that they should be the largest number of people who vote, but they do not express themselves in that way. I think it has a lot to do with disenchantment, with disgruntlement. Perhaps once the phase of disgruntlement has passed, we can then start seeing the youth constituting themselves as a distinct political project in our country. I don't see that at this point.
Interesting. And then, of course, this past weekend, we saw the death of the City of Joburg Mayor, Jolly Di Matongo. What does this mean for the African National Congress, especially at this time, in relation to a very hotly contested and important municipality, a metro in Johannesburg? How do they navigate this space now?
Sakida, it's been quite a setback for the ANC in Johannesburg. They've lost Mayor Jeff Makubo, sadly, and now the new Mayor, Jolidin, is very unfortunate in a moment such as this. They could do without having to experience that. I mean, there's someone who was coming from an election drive. This is not someone whom you hear reports about his past haunting him. It looks as if even if the ANC did not name their mayor candidate, including also in Johannesburg not naming their mayor candidate, they might as well have preferred to go ahead with him. They were trying to gain momentum through their campaign there. It is quite unfortunate. And I also think that, Sakina, in a moment such as this, the taboo in our society is how we are losing skill due to the COVID, and it's becoming the reality of young political leaders and skills being lost in our society across. And a tragic moment such as this is even quite sad, given what has been involved here, which is a car crash. And I think it is quite sad for the ANC, but I do think that the structures will try to build and continue with the campaign.
Well, we'll leave it there for today. Thanks so much, political analyst Dr. Ralph Mathekga, sharing his perspectives on political party campaigns as the country gears up for the 2021 local government elections on the 1st of November. And speaking of, our question of the day also relates to this. And this is what we asked you about earlier on. Please engage us on how you feel about how we should deal with areas where party supporters lack tolerance for each other to a point where things get violent, of which we saw over the weekend. So at Morning Live SABC, we're going to take a quick